Samantha wasn't one to believe in superstitions. To her, old wives' tales were nothing more than remnants of a bygone era, a time when people clung to stories to explain the things they didn't understand. But even she had to admit there was something unsettling about the mirror. She had found it at a dusty flea market on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a dimly lit corner of a vendor's stall. Its ornate frame, carved with intricate floral patterns, caught her eye immediately. The wood was chipped and faded, yet it carried a strange charm, as though it had witnessed centuries of history. "How much for this?" Samantha asked, running her fingers along the frame. The vendor, an elderly woman with clouded eyes, hesitated before answering. $20, she said, her voice low and wary. Samantha raised an eyebrow. "Seems a bit low for something this beautiful." "It's not the kind of thing people want to keep around," the woman replied, her gaze darting to the mirror and then back to Samantha. "Are you sure you want it?" The question lingered in the air for a moment too long, but Samantha dismissed it with a shrug. "I'll take it," she said, handing over the cash. As she carried the mirror to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that the vendor had been relieved to see it go. When Samantha brought the mirror home, she placed it in the hallway just outside her bedroom. It fit perfectly against the wall, its tarnished glass reflecting the warm glow of the evening sunlight. She stepped back to admire her find, feeling a surge of satisfaction. That night, as she was brushing her teeth, Samantha caught a glimpse of the mirror out of the corner of her eye. It wasn't the mirror itself that made her pause, but her reflection. Something about it felt off. She turned to face it directly, studying her image. Her reflection stared back, mimicking her movements exactly. There was nothing unusual about it, but the unease lingered. "Get a grip," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she turned away, she could have sworn she saw her reflection hesitate, just for a fraction of a second, before following her movement. The next few days passed without incident, and Samantha began to forget about the strange moment. But the mirror didn't let her forget for long. One night, she woke up to a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was coming from outside her window, but when she turned her head, she realized the noise was coming from the hallway. She grabbed her phone and turned on its flashlight, her heart pounding as she stepped out of bed. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like fingernails against glass. When she reached the hallway, she froze. The mirror's surface was rippling, as though it were made of water instead of glass. Her reflection was no longer mimicking her movements. Instead, it stood perfectly still, staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between curiosity and malice. "Samantha," her reflection whispered, its voice faint but unmistakable. Her phone slipped from her hands, the flashlight casting erratic beams of light across the walls as it hit the floor. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "This isn't real," she told herself. "It's just a bad dream." But when she closed her eyes and reopened them, the reflection was still there, watching her. Samantha stood frozen, her body trembling as the figure in the mirror smiled at her, a slow, deliberate curve of the lips that felt more predatory than reassuring. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that pressed heavily on her ears. She wanted to look away, but the reflection held her gaze, its eyes shimmering with something dark and unrecognizable. What are you?" Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. The reflection tilted its head, its smile widening. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the rippling surface of the mirror stilled. The reflection returned to normal, mimicking her wide-eyed, panicked expression perfectly. Samantha stumbled backward until her back hit the wall. Her heart thundered in her chest, and her breathing was ragged. She wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but her legs refused to move. "This isn't happening," she muttered, clutching her head with trembling hands. "I'm just overtired. That's all." But deep down, she knew it wasn't exhaustion. There was something wrong with the mirror, something deeply, fundamentally wrong. She eventually forced herself to return to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house made her jump, and she kept her eyes fixed on the hallway, half expecting to see the mirror's surface rippling again. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with distorted reflections and voices whispering her name. The next morning, Samantha considered getting rid of the mirror. She carried it into the garage, covering it with an old blanket so she wouldn't have to see it. For a moment, she felt relief, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. That night, as she was sitting in the living room, she heard the tapping again. Her stomach sank as the sound grew louder, echoing through the house. She tried to ignore it, turning up the volume on the television, but the noise seemed to cut through everything. She grabbed a flashlight and reluctantly made her way to the garage. The tapping grew louder with each step, and when she opened the door, she froze. The blanket she had used to cover the mirror was on the floor, crumpled in a heap. The mirror stood upright against the wall, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't mimicking her. Instead, it was staring directly at her, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Samantha's breath hitched. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice trembling. The reflection's lips moved, but no sound came out. It pointed at her, its finger pressing against the glass. Then it mouthed a single word, "Come." She took a step back, shaking her head. "No, I'm not playing your game." The reflection's expression darkened. Its hand pressed harder against the glass, and for a moment, Samantha thought it might actually break through. The surface rippled violently, and the tapping turned into a deafening pounding. She turned and ran back into the house, slamming the door shut behind her. Her chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath. She didn't sleep that night, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do. The next morning, she decided to call an antique expert. The man who answered her call introduced himself as Dr. Gregory Walters, a historian specializing in cursed objects and occult artifacts. Samantha felt a pang of embarrassment as she explained her situation, expecting him to laugh or dismiss her concerns. Instead, he listened intently. "You did the right thing by calling me," he said when she finished. "Objects like this are rare, but they do exist. I've encountered similar cases before. What should I do?" Samantha asked, clutching the phone tightly. "I'll come to your house and examine the mirror," Dr. Walters replied. "But I need you to promise me something. Don't interact with it. Don't look into it, and don't speak to it. Can you do that?" "Yes," Samantha said, though her voice wavered. Dr. Walters arrived later that afternoon. He was a tall, thin man with sharp features and an air of quiet authority. He carried a leather briefcase and a small wooden box, both of which he handled with great care. When Samantha led him to the garage, he stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the mirror. "This is older than I expected," he murmured. "Where did you find it?" "At a flea market," Samantha said. The vendor didn't say much about it, but she seemed eager to get rid of it. Dr. Walters nodded, his expression grim. "That's often the case with items like this. People don't want to deal with the consequences." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a notebook, a small vial of liquid, and a bundle of sage. As he began examining the mirror, Samantha watched nervously from a safe distance. "The carvings on the frame are significant," Dr. Walters said, tracing his fingers over the intricate patterns. "They're not just decorative, they're sigils. Protective wards meant to contain something." "Contain what?" Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Walters glanced at her, his expression serious. "A spirit, most likely, or something worse." As he continued his examination, the mirror's surface began to ripple again. Dr. Walters stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "It's reacting to my presence," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means it knows we're trying to stop it," Dr. Walters replied. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the lights flickered. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine as the mirror's surface darkened, its reflection vanishing entirely. In its place was a void, a black, swirling abyss that seemed to pull at her very soul. Dr. Walters began chanting under his breath, lighting the sage and waving it in front of the mirror. The smoke billowed around the frame, and for a moment the darkness seemed to recede. But then, a hand reached out from the void. Samantha screamed and stumbled back as the hand emerged, its pale, skeletal fingers stretching toward her. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her chest as the entity pulled itself further from the void. Dr. Walters didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his chanting growing louder, the words spilling from his lips in a language Samantha didn't recognize. The hand stopped, trembling as if held back by an invisible force. The mirror's surface rippled violently, and the sound of shattering glass echoed through the room, though the mirror remained intact. "Stay back!" Dr. Walters barked at Samantha, his voice sharp and commanding. Samantha pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as she watched the figure retreat into the mirror. The ripples slowed, and the surface returned to its reflective state, but the air still felt thick with menace. Dr. Walters wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the sage back into his bag. "This mirror is more dangerous than I thought," he said, his voice low. "Well, what was that thing?" Samantha stammered. "It's not just a spirit," Dr. Walters said grimly. "It's something far older and far darker. A parasitic entity. It uses mirrors as a gateway, a way to reach into our world. Samantha's stomach churned. Why would it want me? Dr. Walters glanced at her, his expression unreadable. It doesn't want you. It wants your place. Your life. It's been watching you, waiting for the right moment to cross over. The weight of his words sank into her, and for a moment, Samantha felt like she might collapse. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Walters hesitated. We need to destroy it, he said. But it's not as simple as breaking the mirror. If we do that without the proper ritual, we risk releasing the entity entirely. We need to banish it back to where it came from. And how do we do that? Dr. Walters opened the wooden box he had brought, revealing a collection of strange objects, candles, crystals, and a dagger with a jagged black blade. It's a complicated process, he said. We'll need to perform the ritual tonight, during the witching hour. That's when the veil between worlds is thinnest. Samantha nodded, though fear twisted her stomach into knots. She didn't have much of a choice. Whatever was in that mirror, she couldn't let it stay. As midnight approached, Samantha and Dr. Walters prepared for the ritual. They moved the mirror into the center of the living room, clearing the space of furniture to make room for a large, circular pattern Dr. Walters had drawn on the floor using chalk. Symbols and runes surrounded the circle, their meanings a mystery to Samantha. Once we begin, you must stay inside the circle with me, Dr. Walters instructed. No matter what happens, don't leave the circle. Do you understand? Samantha nodded, clutching a small crystal he had given her. I understand. Dr. Walters lit the candles, their flames casting flickering shadows across the walls. He began chanting, his voice deep and resonant, filling the room with an almost tangible energy. The mirror's surface shimmered, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. Samantha's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the mirror began to ripple again. This time, the figure didn't hesitate. It stepped through the surface, its form taller and more imposing than before. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its skeletal hands stretched toward the circle. Dr. Walters raised the dagger, his chanting growing louder. The entity snarled, a guttural, inhuman sound that made Samantha's skin crawl. It lunged toward them, but the symbols on the floor flared to life, glowing with a bright, golden light. The entity recoiled, hissing in pain as it struck an invisible barrier. It paced around the circle, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a predator searching for a weakness. You cannot have her, Dr. Walters shouted, his voice filled with authority. The entity laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the room. You think you can stop me, mortal? It said, its voice a guttural mix of whispers and growls. I have waited centuries for this moment. You are nothing but a fleeting speck. Dr. Walters didn't falter. He plunged the dagger into the center of the circle, and the light grew brighter, blindingly so. The entity screamed, its voice shattering glass and rattling the walls. Samantha covered her ears, tears streaming down her face as the sound pierced her mind. The entity thrashed, its form dissolving into black smoke as the light consumed it. The mirror's surface rippled violently, and with a deafening crack, the glass shattered, pieces flying in every direction. When the light faded, the room was silent. The mirror was nothing but a broken frame, its power gone. Dr. Walters sank to his knees, breathing heavily. It's done, he said, his voice hoarse. Samantha stared at the shattered glass, her body trembling. Is it really gone? Dr. Walters nodded. It's gone. The mirror was its anchor to this world. Without it, it can't return. Relief washed over Samantha, but it was tempered by exhaustion and lingering fear. She knew she would never forget what she had seen, or the entity's chilling laugh. As Dr. Walters packed his things, he turned to her. Be careful what you bring into your home, he said. Not everything is as harmless as it seems. Samantha nodded, her gaze lingering on the broken mirror. She had learned that lesson the hard way. Though the mirror was gone, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, late at night, she would catch glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces, just a flicker, gone as quickly as it appeared. But she told herself it was nothing. After all, the mirror was destroyed. The entity was gone, wasn't it? Over the next few weeks, Samantha did everything she could to return to normalcy. She cleaned her house from top to bottom, rearranged the furniture, and threw away anything she thought might carry even the faintest trace of the mirror. She burned the blanket that had once covered it, scrubbed the chalk marks off the living room floor, and even bought new curtains to brighten up the space. But despite her efforts, the unease lingered. It wasn't just her imagination. Small, unexplainable things kept happening. Doors she was certain she'd closed were left slightly ajar. The television turned on by itself in the middle of the night, playing static until she yanked the plug from the wall. Her bathroom mirror began fogging up even when she hadn't used the shower, and faint handprints appeared on the glass, too small and too faint to be her own. Samantha tried to rationalize it all. She convinced herself it was paranoia, that her mind was playing tricks on her after the trauma of what she'd experienced. But the sense of being watched never went away. One evening, as the sun set and the house fell into shadow, Samantha stood in her kitchen washing dishes. The rhythmic sound of running water and clinking plates was oddly soothing, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of calm. Then she noticed it. In the reflection of the kitchen window, something was standing behind her. Her body froze, and her breath caught in her throat. The figure was dark and indistinct, more shadow than substance, but it was unmistakable. It didn't move, it simply stood there watching her. Summoning every ounce of courage, Samantha spun around, gripping the soapy plate like a weapon. The kitchen was empty. She turned back to the window, and the reflection was gone. Her hands trembled as she set the plate down in the sink. "It's not real," she whispered to herself. "It's not real." But deep down, she knew it was. That night, Samantha dreamed of the mirror. In the dream, it was whole again, its glass surface dark and rippling. Her reflection stood on the other side, staring at her with glowing eyes and a twisted smile. "Samantha," it whispered, its voice soft and melodic. "You thought you could destroy me?" Samantha tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. "You broke the mirror," the reflection continued, "but you didn't break me." Its hand pressed against the glass, and Samantha felt an icy chill spread through her chest. "I'm still here," it said, "and I'm not done with you." She woke up with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. The room was pitch black, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her heart raced as she fumbled for the bedside lamp, her fingers shaking as they found the switch. The light flooded the room, and she breathed a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. On the wall across from her bed, written in what looked like black ash, were the words, "I see you." Samantha didn't sleep for the rest of the night. She sat curled up on the couch with every light in the house turned on, clutching her phone as she debated whether to call Dr. Walters. Part of her didn't want to bother him. He had done everything he could, hadn't he? But the other part of her, the part that was terrified, knew she couldn't face this alone. When the sun finally rose, she dialed his number. It rang several times before he answered, his voice groggy and irritated. "Samantha?" he asked. "What's going on?" "It's not over," she said, her voice trembling. "The mirror, the entity, it's still here." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "That's impossible," Dr. Walters said. "We destroyed the anchor. It shouldn't have any way to remain in your world." "Well, it's here," Samantha snapped. "It's watching me. It's leaving messages on my walls." Dr. Walters sighed heavily. "I'll come back. Don't do anything until I get there." When Dr. Walters arrived, he looked tired but determined. He carried the same wooden box as before, though Samantha noticed it seemed heavier this time. "I need you to show me everything," he said. She led him to the bedroom and pointed at the wall where the words had appeared. The black ash was still there, the letters stark against the pale paint. Dr. Walters frowned, running his fingers over the marks. "This isn't just residual energy," he muttered. "It's actively trying to communicate with you." "Why? What does it want?" Dr. Walters turned to her, his expression grim. "It wants to finish what it started. It wants you." Samantha felt a wave of nausea. "But why me? What did I do?" "It's not about what you did," Dr. Walters said. "It's about the connection you've made. By bringing the mirror into your home, by interacting with it, you've created a bond. It sees you as its way into this world." Samantha's knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed. "So what do we do?" Dr. Walters hesitated. "We'll have to sever the bond," he said. "But it won't be easy. This thing is holding on to you with everything it has." "How do we sever it?" Samantha asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dr. Walters opened his wooden box, pulling out a black candle and a small jar filled with crimson powder. "We'll have to perform a binding ritual," he said. "It's dangerous, but it's the only way." "Dangerous how?" Dr. Walters didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set up the materials on the floor, drawing another circle of sigils around the candle. Finally, he looked at her. "If the ritual goes wrong," he said, "it could pull you into its world instead of severing the bond." Samantha's blood ran cold. "What happens if I get pulled in?" Dr. Walters didn't blink. "You don't come back." Despite her terror, Samantha agreed to the ritual. She couldn't live like this, constantly afraid, constantly watched. If there was even a chance of breaking free, she had to take it. As the sun set, Dr. Walters lit the candle and began chanting. The room grew colder, and Samantha felt a familiar pressure in the air, like something was pressing down on her chest. The candle's flame flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows across the walls. The crimson powder glowed faintly, and the air filled with the scent of burning metal. Then the whispering began. "Samantha?" The voice was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. Samantha clutched the crystal Dr. Walters had given her, her knuckles white as the chanting intensified. The mirror, or whatever remained of it, was fighting back. The whispers turned into guttural growls, rising and falling like a chorus of voices arguing over her name. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, creeping closer to the circle. Samantha's grip on the crystal tightened until her palm throbbed. Dr. Walters' chanting grew louder, his voice shaking the air, but the entity fought back with a vengeance. The candle's flame flared and extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. Samantha gasped as icy tendrils of air wrapped around her arms, tugging her toward the edge of the circle. "Do not step outside the boundary," Dr. Walters roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. Samantha dug her heels into the floor, her body trembling as she fought against the invisible pull. "It's trying to drag me out," she screamed, her voice cracking. Dr. Walters grabbed a second candle from his box, lighting it quickly. The circle's sigils flared to life, glowing a brilliant white. The shadows recoiled, but the whispers intensified, now layered with screams and laughter that echoed in Samantha's mind. "I'm almost done," Dr. Walters shouted, his voice strained. "Just hold on." The pressure around Samantha grew unbearable. It felt as though hands, cold, skeletal, and merciless, were gripping her entire body, trying to crush her. Her vision blurred as her head pounded with the force of the entity's presence. Then she saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest, two glowing red eyes emerged. They locked onto her, unblinking, filled with a hatred so intense that it seemed to pierce through her very soul. The entity's form became clearer, rising from the shadows like a figure pulling itself from deep water. Its skeletal frame was wrapped in a black, swirling mist, its movements jerky and unnatural. The room grew colder with each step it took toward the circle. Dr. Walters finished his chant and slammed the black dagger into the center of the circle. A wave of energy erupted from the sigils, sending the entity stumbling back. It screamed, a sound so inhuman and piercing that Samantha clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. The glowing symbols began to spin, twisting and merging into a single point of light above the circle. The entity hissed and lunged forward, but the barrier held firm. "Now," Dr. Walters shouted. "Focus on the crystal. You need to sever the bond." Samantha held the crystal close, her mind racing. She didn't know how to sever a bond. What did that even mean? But as the entity slammed against the barrier again, she closed her eyes and focused on one thing: her will to be free. The crystal grew warm in her hands, then hot, almost burning. She clenched it tighter, gritting her teeth as the warmth spread through her arms and into her chest. The entity shrieked, its body convulsing as the connection between them weakened. "You're mine," it roared, its voice like a storm, ripping through the room. "You can't escape me." Samantha's resolve hardened. She opened her eyes and stared directly at the entity, her voice shaking but firm. "You don't own me. You never did." The light above the circle exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding glow. The entity screamed one last time, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black smoke. The smoke was pulled into the light, twisting and writhing before vanishing entirely. The room fell silent. Samantha collapsed to the floor, the crystal slipping from her hand as exhaustion overtook her. Dr. Walters was on his knees, his breathing ragged as he surveyed the room. "It's gone," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The bond is broken." Samantha stared at the empty space where the entity had stood, her body trembling with relief and residual fear. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Dr. Walters nodded. "I'm sure. It can't reach you anymore." The days that followed were quiet. For the first time in weeks, Samantha felt at peace. The house no longer felt heavy or oppressive, and the sense of being watched was gone. She cleaned the room where the ritual had taken place, scrubbing away the last remnants of chalk and ash. The crystal, now dull and lifeless, sat on her bedside table as a reminder of what she had survived. But even as life returned to normal, a part of her remained cautious. She avoided mirrors when she could, and never left reflective surfaces uncovered. One night, As she was getting ready for bed, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. It was just her, tired but alive. She smiled faintly and turned off the light. As she left the room, she didn't see the faint ripple that passed across the mirror's surface, or the shadow that moved behind her reflection. The weeks that followed were uneventful. Samantha began to feel the weight of her ordeal lifting, replaced with a tentative hope that her life might finally return to normal. The oppressive atmosphere in the house had vanished, and for the first time in months, she was able to sleep through the night. She went back to work, reconnected with friends, and even began seeing a therapist to help process everything that had happened. Though she didn't share the full story, who would believe her? She explained it as a traumatic break-in, something that had left her shaken but determined to heal. For a while, it seemed like the nightmare was truly over. But then the dreams began. They started subtly at first. Samantha would wake up in the middle of the night with no memory of the dream itself, just a lingering sense of unease. Over time, the dreams became clearer, more vivid. She was back in her house, but it wasn't right. The walls were too dark, the windows were covered with an impenetrable black mist, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. She would walk through the rooms, hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sometimes she would see movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow darting across the hallway, or a figure standing just out of sight. When she turned to look, nothing was there. Each time she woke from the dreams, her heart would be pounding, her sheets damp with sweat. One night, the dream changed. This time, she stood in her living room, staring at the spot where the mirror had once hung. The wall was empty, but her reflection appeared nonetheless, rippling like water. "Why did you think you could get rid of me?" her reflection asked, its voice distorted, like it was coming from underwater. Samantha tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted in place, forced to watch as her reflection stepped out of the wall, its movements jerky and unnatural. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was her, twisted wrong, and smiling in a way that made her skin crawl. "You invited me in," it said, reaching for her. "You'll never be rid of me." She woke up screaming, her chest heaving as she clutched her blankets. The room was dark, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move in the shadows. She scrambled for the bedside lamp, flicking it on and flooding the room with light. Nothing was there, but the uneasy feeling didn't fade. She could still hear the echo of her reflection's voice, faint but insistent. "You'll never be rid of me." Samantha didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she called Dr. Walters. When he answered, his voice was groggy but concerned. "Samantha? What's wrong?" "It's back," she said, her voice shaking. "I don't know how, but it's back." Dr. Walters sighed heavily. "That's impossible. We severed the bond. The entity is gone." "Then explain the dreams," Samantha snapped. "Explain why I can still feel it watching me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Dr. Walters finally spoke, his tone was grave. "I'll come over tonight. But if what you're saying is true, this might be worse than I thought." That evening, Dr. Walters arrived with his wooden box, his expression darker than Samantha had ever seen it. He wasted no time setting up his tools in the living room, sprinkling salt around the perimeter and lighting a bundle of sage. "Tell me everything," he said as he worked. Samantha recounted the dreams, every chilling detail, and the lingering sense of being watched. As she spoke, Dr. Walters' frown deepened. "This shouldn't be happening," he muttered. "The ritual we performed was thorough. There was no way for the entity to remain in this world." "Then what's happening to me?" Samantha demanded. Dr. Walters didn't answer right away. Instead, he took out a small mirror from his box and placed it in the center of the room. "We need to see if there's any trace of the entity left," he said. "If it's still connected to you, this will reveal it." Samantha hesitated, dread pooling in her stomach. "And if it is still connected?" Dr. Walters didn't meet her eyes. "Then we'll figure it out." He began chanting, his voice low and rhythmic, as the mirror's surface began to shimmer. The air in the room grew heavy, and Samantha felt the familiar pressure pressing against her chest. The mirror rippled, and for a moment, she thought she saw her reflection. But it wasn't her. It was the twisted version from her dreams. The reflection smiled, its eyes glowing faintly red. "Hello again," it said, its voice soft and mocking. Dr. Walters froze, his chant faltering as he stared at the mirror. This can't be," he whispered. Samantha's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. "What is it? What's happening?" Dr. Walters turned to her, his face pale. "The entity didn't fully leave. A part of it stayed behind, hidden within you." Samantha staggered back, shaking her head. No, that's not possible." It used you as an anchor, Dr. Walters said, his voice trembling. When we destroyed the mirror, it latched onto you instead. It's been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The reflection in the mirror laughed, a sound that sent chills down Samantha's spine. You can't get rid of me, it said. I'm part of you now. Samantha's hands clenched into fists. What do we do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Walters didn't answer immediately. He stared at the reflection, his jaw tight. Finally, he said, we'll have to go deeper. We'll have to confront it directly. Samantha's heart sank. What does that mean? It means we're going to have to enter its realm, Dr. Walters said, and force it out. Samantha felt the world around her grow colder at his words. The idea of stepping into the entity's realm, the place it came from, was unbearable. But the reflection in the mirror seemed to grow stronger as Dr. Walters spoke, its grin widening, as though it could hear every word. What happens if we go there? Samantha asked, her voice trembling. What if we don't come back? Dr. Walters hesitated, his face grim. There's no guarantee we'll return. But if we do nothing, the entity will consume you. It's already gaining strength. You've seen it in your dreams, felt it in the shadows. The reflection chuckled, the sound reverberating through the room. You're already mine, it purred. Why fight it? Shut up! Samantha screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy book, and hurling it at the mirror. The reflection rippled but remained intact, its smile unbroken. Dr. Walters stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We don't have much time. If we're going to do this, it has to be now. How do we even get there? Samantha asked, her fear mixing with frustration. Dr. Walters opened his wooden box and pulled out a black obsidian stone etched with intricate runes. This will act as a key, he explained. The entity's connection to you works both ways. It's using you as a bridge to this world, but that bridge can also take us to its world. Samantha stared at the stone, dread pooling in her stomach. And once we're there, we sever the connection at its source, Dr. Walters said. But I'll be honest with you, it's going to fight back, and it will do everything in its power to keep us there. The reflection in the mirror leaned closer, its glowing red eyes locking onto Samantha's. You'll never make it out alive, it hissed. Samantha swallowed hard, her throat dry. Let's do it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Walters instructed Samantha to sit inside the protective circle he drew on the floor. He placed the obsidian stone in the center, lighting several candles around it. The room was eerily silent, the air heavy with tension. Once we're there, Dr. Walters said, stay close to me. The entity will try to separate us, confuse us. Don't trust anything you see or hear. Samantha nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched a small vial of salt he had given her. What's this for? It's a ward, Dr. Walters explained. If it gets too close, throw the salt in its direction. It won't stop it, but it will slow it down. He began chanting, his voice low and rhythmic. The obsidian stone began to glow faintly, its runes pulsing with light. The air in the room grew colder, and Samantha's breath came out in visible puffs. The glow from the stone intensified, and the room began to warp. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, the shadows deepening until they swallowed the light entirely. Then, everything went black. When Samantha opened her eyes, she was no longer in her living room. The air was thick and humid, filled with a faint metallic scent. The ground beneath her feet was soft and damp, like wet earth. Around her, the world was shrouded in darkness, broken only by the faint, pulsing glow of the obsidian stone in Dr. Walters' hand. This is it, Dr. Walters said quietly. The entity's realm. Samantha looked around, her heart pounding. The landscape was barren and alien, filled with jagged rocks and pools of inky black liquid that reflected nothing. In the distance, faint whispers echoed, growing louder with each passing moment. Where is it? Samantha asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Walters scanned the horizon. It's here, watching, waiting. As if on cue, a low growl rumbled through the air, sending a shiver down Samantha's spine. She turned toward the sound and froze. The entity was emerging from the shadows, its form larger and more grotesque than before. Its skeletal frame was wrapped in tendrils of black mist, its glowing red eyes fixed on Samantha with an intensity that made her knees weak. You shouldn't have come here, it said, its voice a guttural snarl. Dr. Walters stepped in front of Samantha, holding the obsidian stone high. We're not leaving until this ends, he said firmly. The entity laughed, a deep, echoing sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. You think you can defeat me here? In my domain? Dr. Walters began chanting again, the runes on the stone glowing brighter. The entity shrieked, its form writhing as the light from the stone spread through the air. "Now, Samantha," Dr. Walters shouted. "Throw the salt." Samantha fumbled with the vial, her hands shaking as she opened it and flung the contents toward the entity. The salt hit its mist-like body, causing it to recoil with a hiss. "You'll regret this," the entity roared, its voice echoing like thunder. Dr. Walters continued chanting, his voice unwavering despite the chaos. The obsidian stone pulsed with light, sending waves of energy through the air. The entity shrieked again, its form beginning to waver. "No," it bellowed. "You cannot banish me." Samantha felt a surge of determination. She grabbed the stone from Dr. Walters' hand, its warmth searing her skin, and pointed it directly at the entity. "You don't belong here," she shouted, her voice strong and defiant. "This ends now." The stone's light exploded outward, engulfing the entity in a blinding glow. Its screams filled the air as its form disintegrated, the shadows dissipating into nothingness. And then there was silence. When Samantha opened her eyes again, she was back in her living room. Dr. Walters sat slumped on the floor beside her, his face pale but alive. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Walters nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "It's over. You're free." Samantha leaned back, tears streaming down her face as relief washed over her. The nightmare was finally over. Or so she hoped.